This is going to be Irish stories today, and this is my third time in this week telling Irish stories. So I think I have them down pat. You never know. You never know. I do have a little bit. My family said that we were Welsh Irish, and I've been to Ireland and I've been to Wales, but I really don't know my background. I was in Ireland and told a couple of stories, and our guide said that my accent was good, but he was German, so I don't know how much he could tell anyway. So the first story, though, is about a tradition in Ireland. It's called a céilí, and a céilí is a party, but it's a party with rules. So this is what, and I was at a céilí last night, and they didn't have the rules, but traditionally it is rules. So the rules is that if you find some whiskey laying around your house, now I don't know if that happens at your house, it doesn't happen at mine, but they must just find it somehow, that you decide to invite everyone for a party. The rules come in where in order to get the whiskey, you have to sing a song, play a tune, or tell a story. And so the story begins of this céilí. There once was a very wealthy farmer in Ireland, and one day he found some whiskey that he didn't know was lying around his house. And so he invited all of his friends and neighbors to come and have a céilí. Well, the party was going strong. There was music, dancing, stories, the whiskey was flowing when the door opened and Jimmy, the new hired hand, came in. Now, Jimmy had been looking forward to that whiskey all day long, and he was ready. So he picked up a glass and he held it out, and his master put up the bottle of whiskey and said, "So, Jimmy, have you got a story for us?" Well, now, have you ever been ready to tell a story or a joke, and then when somebody mentions it, it just goes out of your head? Well, that's exactly what happened to Jimmy. He couldn't think of that story. He couldn't think of any story that he had ever been told in his life. Well, his master saw the look on his face and tipped that whiskey back up and said, "Oh, no, Jimmy, no story, no whiskey. Out you go." And so he pushed him out on his bum. Well, now, Jimmy wanted that whiskey desperately, and so he was walking all around the farm trying to think of any story that he'd ever heard. When he was finally walking along the lake that bordered his master's farm, he walked past a little rowboat, and he saw something shiny in the back of the rowboat. Curious as to what it might be, he put one big clodhopper of a foot into the boat, and as he was bringing the other one in, it caught on the edge of the boat, sending him flying into the boat, where he hit his head on the seat and knocked himself completely out. When he awoke, he was in the middle of the lake, and he could not see land anywhere. And he had the worst headache that he had ever had. He put his hand up to his head, and he felt hair. Now, Jimmy had hair, but his hair was short, a buzz cut, a crew cut. And this hair was long and red and curly. And with a little bit of a knot in his stomach, he looked over at the edge of the boat to see his reflection. And what looked back up at him was not the reflection of Jimmy the farmhand, but instead the reflection of a pretty little lass with sparkly eyes and red hair and some freckles over her nose. And now with a stone in his stomach, he put his hands to his chest. And what had never been there was now there. And now with a big rock in his stomach, he put his hands to his pants, and what was always there was now gone. He grabbed those oars, and Jimmy rowed and rowed and rowed as fast as he could, and he finally, just at dawn, got to a farm. But it wasn't his master's farm. It was just a little farm with a little white cottage and a thatched roof. And as he rowed up to the shore, the door opened, and a handsome young farmer came out. And when he saw Jimmy in the boat, his grin got bigger, and he came down and he said, "Why, lass, are you lost? Why don't you come up to the cottage and we'll have a cup of tea and talk about your predicament?" And he put his hand out, and Jimmy put his hand in his, and it felt good. And he helped Jimmy out of the boat, and as they walked up, he put his hand on the small of Jimmy's back, and well, that felt good too. And when they got up to the cottage, the farmer made tea for them both, and they talked, and they laughed, and they found out that they had so much in common. They talked the whole day through, and within 2 days, they were married, and it was a good life. The farmer couldn't believe all of the farm chores that Jimmy could do, sometimes even better than he could. Oh, Jimmy was not good at housekeeping or cooking, but it didn't matter. They enjoyed each other's company so much. And a year went by, and a babe was born, and then I'm told that soon another one followed. And then one day, the young farmer came into the cottage and said, "You know, I was down at the boat well, and I found some whiskey down there. Why don't we have us a Kaylee?" And Jimmy said, "Oh, good idea. You invite everyone, and I'll make some food." And he said, "Oh, lass, don't bother yourself with that. They'll bring food," for everyone in the village knew Jimmy's reputation for cooking. Well, the night of the Kaylee came, and it was a wonderful time. Songs and music and dancing, the whiskey was flowing. And then that funny thing happened to the whiskey that sometimes happens. The bottle became empty. And so the young farmer went up to Jimmy and said, "Lass, I got to go down to the boat well and get us some more whiskey." And she said, "Oh, you're having such a good time. I'll go down and get it for you." And he kissed her on the cheek and said, "Oh, you're a good wife, lass." And so down she went to the boat well. On the way to get there, she had to pass that little rowboat that had brought her to her new life. And as she passed it, she saw something shining in the back of the boat. Curious as to what it might be, she put one dainty foot into the boat, and as she was putting the other one in, it caught on the edge of the boat, sent her sailing into the boat, where she hit her head on the seat and knocked herself completely out. And when she came to, she was in the middle of the lake, couldn't see land anywhere, and had without a doubt the worst headache that she'd ever had. She put her hand to her forehead to see if she was bleeding when she felt hair. But it wasn't long red hair, it was short, like a buzz cut. And with a little bit of a grin on the face, Jimmy looked over the edge of the boat to see a reflection. But what looked up was not the reflection of a pretty little lass with red curly hair and shining eyes and a sprinkling of freckles on her nose, but the face of Jimmy the farmhand. And now, with a bit of a grin on his face, he sat up and he put his hands to his chest, and what had been there was now gone. And then with a big grin on his face, he put his hands to his pants, and what was gone was now returned. With a huge smile, Jimmy grabbed those oars and he rowed to shore, and he got to his master's farm. And the lights were on in the big house, and there was music playing. They were having themselves a Kaylee. And he ran up to the door and opened it, and his master said, "Why, Jimmy, back so soon? Have you already got a story for us?" Well, Jimmy grabbed a glass and he said, "Have I got a story for you?" And he held out the glass, and his master poured it, and he told that story. And it was voted the best story of that night, and he continued to tell it for many years, and it was always voted the very best story. Well, Jimmy was a good farmhand, and when his master died, he left the farm to Jimmy, and he continued working it and making it prosper, and he had a good life. But oftentimes the people of the village would see him walking along the shore of that lake and staring out, and sometimes there was a little bit of a tear, they thought, coming down his cheek. And I like to think that maybe he's thinking of that handsome young farmer and those two babes he left behind. And that's the end of the story. Now this story is just, I don't know, it's just sweet. When I read it, I just liked it. I like practicing it. But it's, nothing dynamic. It's just a sweet story. It's called The Beekeeper and the Hare. Long ago, there lived a young man in a cottage right on the edge of the moor. And even though he lived alone, he wasn't lonely, for he was a beekeeper, and he loved his bees. And they trusted him. In fact, the people in the village said that they thought that they could talk with each other. Well, the beekeeper knew that he could tell the mood of the bees from their buzzing. And if they could understand him, well, wouldn't that be grand? One night he was standing outside his cottage looking over the moor and the gloam, and when he heard hounds barking. And then he saw a hare running across the moor, the hounds in close pursuit. The hare ran right to him and jumped into his arms. He held it tight and he shook his arm and he yelled and he scared those hounds away. And then he held that hare until its breathing slowed and its shaking stopped. And then he put it on the ground for it to run away. But it didn't. It stayed right at his feet. And when he went into the cottage, it went in too. And it followed him all around as he made his evening meal. And when he sat down at the table to eat, the hare jumped on the table right next to his plate. Well, this delighted the beekeeper, and so he gave it some of his food. And that's when he saw its eyes for the first time. Now, the beekeeper had seen many dark-eyed hares and even one pink-eyed hare for sale at a village shop. But this hare's eyes were blue as the summer sky over the moor. And he decided right then and there he was going to keep it as a pet. And so, the next morning, he took it to introduce it to the bees, because as you all know, bees like to know exactly what's happening around them. And about 5 or 6 of the bees flew around the hare's head, and then, seemingly satisfied, they flew off to do their day's work. And the beekeeper knew that he had a new family member. That afternoon, he saw an old woman coming across the moor. Someone to buy me honey, he thought. But when she got to him, it wasn't honey that she wanted. She was fixated on that hare. And she said, "'Tis a fine hare you've got there." There was something about the woman that he just didn't like, that bothered him. "How much do you want for it?" "'Tis not for sale." "I'll give you a bonny piece of gold." "'Tis not for sale." But the woman paid no attention. She had her arms out and was bending down to pick up the hare when a dozen bees flew at her face, making her jerk up. And then an entire swarm came at her. She turned and began running across the moor, the bees behind her. She shook her fist and yelled back, "Best keep a close eye on yourself and that hare, beekeeper, if you know what's good for you." And then she was gone. 2 days later, he was in the village to sell his honey. He was standing outside of a shop talking to a friend of his when he saw that woman across the road. And he said to his friend, "Do you know who that woman is?" "I don't know her name," he said, "but some folks, they call her a witch." And right then and there, the beekeeper decided that he would heed her words. And so that night, for the very first time in his life, he barred his door and his windows. Well, summertime went on, and summer soon moved into fall, and the bees were now busy getting themselves and their hives ready for the winter, as was the beekeeper. One day he was splitting wood down in the moor when he saw a wagon crossing on the road. Hardly anybody used that moor road, and so it was good to see somebody, and so he waved at the driver, and the driver waved at him, and then he went back to splitting his wood. When he was finished, he was going to go to his cottage. He saw there was something laying in the road. He went over, and it was a bag of grain. It must have fallen off the wagon. Oh, he hated to think of that poor horse without his supper tonight. And then he thought, well, I don't have anything specific to do today. I'll just take it to him. And so he hitched up his pony to his little cart. He put the hare in his shirt, and off they went. His cart was much lighter than the wagon, and he knew the road very well, so it was only a little over an hour when he caught up to the driver and waved him down. This fell off of your wagon back by my cottage." "The cottage? By the moor?" "Aye." "And you brought it all the way to me?" "Aye." "But we're Roma. Most folks will have nothing to do with us." "Well, that doesn't mean that your horse has to go without his supper tonight." Just then the hare picked its head out of his shirt, and the driver said, that hare, it's got blue eyes." "I know, bonny, isn't she?" "My grandmother needs to see this. Mora, come see this hare." the door opened of the wagon, and an old woman came out, and she peered at the hare and said, "Oh, 'tis not a hare, 'tis a lass bewitched to a hare, and I know the besom who did it. If it hadn't been for the bees, she would have snatched her right away from me." "You're friends with the bees?" "Aye, I love them." "Then maybe I can help. Listen carefully to what I say and tell it all to the bees when you get back to your cottage and ask for their help. The woman who did this is a witch, and she wants the lass back. Her powers will be strongest at midnight on All Hallows Eve. That morning, tie a cord around the hare's neck and the other around your wrist. Then get yourself and the hare as far away from your cottage as you can. Hold on tight, especially at midnight, for she'll try to snatch her away. It may go well and it may go ill, but that's all I can tell you." And she went back into the wagon. The driver once again said thank you for the grain, and the two men parted ways. And when the beekeeper got back to his cottage, he told the bees exactly what the old woman had said, and he asked them for their help, and from inside he heard angry buzzing. On the morning of All Hallows Eve, he did exactly what that old woman had said. He hitched up his pony to his cart, he tied the cord around the hare's neck and around his wrist, and then they got into the wagon, he put the hare in his shirt, and they took off. Through the moor, over a bridge, past his village, past village after village after village. He traveled all day, and then in the night when the moon came up full and bright, he just kept traveling. When suddenly the hare was yanked out of his shirt. If it hadn't been for that cord, it would have been gone. He pulled her back, and he held on tight. He knew it was midnight, and he felt that hare getting pulled this way and that and this way and that, trying to take it from his arms. And then a cloud went across the moon, and everything was dark. He could see nothing. He could just feel that jerking and jerking. And then everything went still, and he was holding something much larger in his arms. And when the moon passed and he could see again, he saw that he was holding a blue-eyed lass, and she was the bonniest lass that he had ever seen. He set her in the seat next to him and put a cloak around her that he'd brought along, and they headed off in the first village that they came to in the morning. They were married. They took a long time getting back to his cottage, 5 or 6 days. And so it was then, like I said, about a week before he went through his own village. And he saw that friend of his that had told him about the woman. He stopped and introduced his friend to his new bride, and then his friend said, "Did you hear about that woman that I told you was a witch?" "No." "Well, they found her dead in the moor by your cottage the morning after All Hallows Eve." "No." "And the strangest thing is, the doctor says that she was stung to death by bees." "No." "Aye, how could that be? The bees are all in their hives now for the winter." "Aye, how could that be?" But the beekeeper and his new bride exchanged a secret smile. And when they got back to the cottage, they went right to the bees, and they told them everything that had happened, and they thanked them for their help. And from inside the hive, you could hear happy buzzing. And that's the end of the story. So another story, this one is called Finn McCool. Maybe you've heard of him. For Finn McCool is a giant. The Irish tell a lot of stories about giants. They come in all kinds of different sizes and dispositions. Finn McCool is a medium-sized giant and usually very kind, except when it comes to Benandonner. Now, Benandonner is a Scottish giant, and he is reported to be the biggest giant in the world. He has red hair and a red beard and a nasty disposition. But Finn McCool and Benandonner had never seen each other. They'd never met each other, but they hated each other. Finn would stand at the eastern edge of Ireland, and he would yell across the North Channel, "Benandonner, you're a tumshie!" And Benandonner, he would stand on the western edge of Scotland, and he'd yell back, "You're a bigger tumshie than I am, Finn McCool." And Finn would yell, "You're the biggest tumshie in the world." And finally one day, Benandonner yelled, "If I could swim across this North Channel, I'd come and I'd beat your hairy hide. Well, we'll just see about that." And so that day, Finn decided that he was going to build a bridge across the North Channel between Ireland and Scotland. And so he did all night long. He built a bridge, a causeway out of rocks. And it was just before dawn when he finished. He went up the path up the mountain where his cottage was where he lived. His wife Uma had just gotten up and was getting herself ready for the day when he said, Uma, get a good fire going. I'm heading over to Scotland, and I'm going to steal some of that Benandonner sheep, and I want you to make me a good Irish mutton stew or Scottish mutton stew when I get home. Finn, you can't be going over to Scotland where Benandonner is. Why, I hear that he's the biggest giant in the world. Oh, Uma, that's just malarkey. You know that all of the Scottish are just wee people. No, Finn, no. I heard that his kilt would cover all of Ireland. Uma, that can't be happening. No, Finn, no. I heard that he's got a magic finger, and that magic finger gives him the strength of 3 more giants his size. Oh, Uma, listen to these tales you've been hearing. None of it's true. I'm going over, and I'm going to get us some sheep, so you get the fire going. So down the mountain he went, and across the causeway. He was climbing up some rocks when he saw above the hills a red glow. Ah, and look at the sunrise that's greeting me. But it wasn't a sunrise. It was the top of Benandonner's head. It was his red hair. He kept going, and then he looked over and he saw the strangest trees that he'd ever seen. They were huge, big around. He would never have been able to get his arms around them, and they had needles that just sprung out all over. He looked up them to see if there was more needles when he got to the bottom of a kilt. And he looked up and realized that he was looking at the legs of Benandonner, and he truly was the biggest giant that Finn had even imagined. So he turned and he ran back down toward that bridge. Oh, he grabbed 3 of Benandonner's sheep on the way. He wasn't going to make it a wasted trip. And he went across that causeway and ran up the hill, just as Benandonner saw that causeway. And he yelled, "I see your bridge, Finn McCool, and I'm coming for ya." And he started to go across. Finn ran up to Uma and he said, Uma, you were right. He's the biggest giant that anybody's ever seen. What are we going to do? We've got to hide. Finn McCool, you've never hidden in your life. You've never avoided trouble, and you're not going to be avoiding trouble now. But Uma, you didn't see him. And she looked out the window, and she did see Benandonner coming across that causeway, and she saw how big he was, but she said, Finn, I've got an idea, and you're going to listen to me. Just keep your mouth shut and let me do the talking. Now go and get me our biggest tin tub, and you set it underneath the tree. While Finn was doing that, she found a big, round, flat rock and took it into her kitchen. When Finn got the tub underneath the tree, she took a sheet and she wrapped him all in it so only his eyes could be seen. And she said, now, Finn, you get yourself into that tub and then you keep your mouth shut. I'm going to do the talking. And then she went back in the cottage and she started to make the batter for griddle cakes when the house started to shake. Boom, boom. And she looked out, and that massive Benandonner was there. Finn McCool, come out and meet your challenger. Well, she came out and said, oh, sir, I'm sorry to tell you, but Finn McCool isn't here. He left this morning to go over on the other side of Ireland. He's going to do some hunting there. He'll be back this afternoon. And Benandonner thought, how big can this man be if he can walk across Ireland and back in less than a day? But he said, well, I need to see him. I'll be waiting. Well, while you wait, would you, if Finn was here, he would be turning the house for me. You see, the wind is coming into the window, and then it brings the dust. Now, if Finn was here, he'd pick the house up and he'd turn it so that I wouldn't get my house dirty. Why, you're kind of a big man. Would you do that for me? Would you turn the house, please? And again, Ben and Donna thought, how big can this Finn McCool be to turn a house? But if he can do it, I can do it. And so he got his arms around that cottage, and he lifted it as much as he could, and he got it up just enough, and he turned it and set it down. Ah, thank you. I was just going to give the wee one over here some waffle cakes. I'll make one for griddle cakes. I'll make one for you. And he looked over and he saw the babe under the tree for the first time. That's a child? Oh, yeah, it's Finn's babe. I know, he's a bit of a runt, but now that he's 9 months old, he's starting to grow a little. 9 months old? How could Finn have a child that big? She said, I'll be back in a minute. She went in the house and she fit and grilled the cakes, made the griddle cakes. But in one, she put that flat stone. The other, she left plain. And when she came out, she said, here, the babe loves these griddle cakes. Here's one for you. And she gave one to the babe. Well, Ben and Donna took that griddle cake and he bit into it, and yow! He screamed and he spit out 2 teeth. He said, what is in these griddle cakes? What? Nothing, they're just griddle cakes. Watch the babe. The babe loves them. And so Finn McCool took that griddle cake and just started nibbling away. And Ben and Donna said, what kind of teeth does that child have? Oh, they're just little buds that are coming in. Put your finger in his mouth. He likes that, and then you could feel his teeth. Now, Ben and Donna might have been the biggest giant in the world, but he was definitely not the smartest giant in the world. And so he took that magic finger, remember it, that gave him all of his strength, and he put that finger into Finn McCool's mouth. And Finn McCool bit down hard, and once again, Ben and Donna, yow! And Finn McCool spit that finger out. Well, you could just see the strength leaving Ben and Donna. Oh, he was still a big man, but most of his strength had gone. And when he saw that, Finn McCool tore off that sheet and said, I'm coming for you, Ben and Donner. Well, Ben and Donner turned and he ran faster than anyone thought that big of a man or that weak of a man could run down that mountain. And he started across that causeway by the time that Finn McCool got down there. And Finn picked up the biggest rock that he could find and he threw it at Ben and Donner. But it missed him. It landed in the North Channel. Now we call it the Isle of Man. And the place where he took that rock, that's now the biggest lake in Ireland, actually in all of Great Britain. It's called Loch Ness. But Ben and Donner made it across. And Finn thought, that's good. And that night, he took that causeway all apart. Well, the two men still yell insults at each other. But never again have they ever actually met. And that's the end of the story. So on the western coast of Ireland is rocky with high cliffs and a very, very strong, rough sea. So it takes people with a lot of strength to live there, especially the fishermen who go out into that sea every day for their livelihood. They tell stories, and sometimes those stories are about the seals that swim around them as they're fishing. They call them selkies. And they say, and well, they should know, that they were once humans who drowned in those seas. They also say that sometimes that the selkies will come to land and they take off their skin, and then they'll dance on the beach or in the shallow water, maybe remembering what it was like to be on 2 legs. And the legend continues that if you see such a selkie without their skin, and you can grab that skin, that you will have control of the selkie. And so, with that knowledge, our story begins with one of those fishermen. Late one afternoon, he brought his boat into the sea. He was sad as usual. He had a house on the high cliff, a cottage, and he'd once had big dreams and hopes, but that rough life had dashed them away. And so now as he came in again, it had been a terrible day. He caught very few fish. And he brought his boat in and he sat down on a rock, and he just didn't have the energy, both in body and in spirit, to climb up that path, up that cliff to that cottage. So he just sat down on a rock and he stared out into the sea. And after a bit, he fell asleep. When he awoke, it was completely dark. He had no idea what time it was. He got up to start to go home when he heard a noise on the other side of a rock, and he climbed up on top of it. And there he saw the most beautiful woman that he'd ever seen dancing on the beach. He knew that she was a Selkie. And then he spotted her skin, and he raced for that skin. She saw him. She raced too, but he got it, and he grabbed it. She barked at him, yelped at him like an animal, and then seemingly caught herself and knew she had to speak as a human and said, "My skin, please give me back my skin." But he didn't want to. He wanted this woman, and so he said, no, I've got it now. Now you be mine. Please. Her eyes filled with tears. "Give me back my skin. I need to go home." Now the fisherman was a kind man, and he felt terrible for him, but he desired her greatly. And so he said, "I will, if you will stay with me for 7 years and be my wife, after 7 years, if you want to leave, then I'll give you back your skin." Well, she had to agree. She had nothing else she could do. And so he wrapped his coat around her, and he led her up the path up to his cottage. And there he gave her some soup, and while she was eating, he took the skin into his barn, and he hid it high in the rafters. And then he went back into the cottage to start his married life. And the fisherman's, that was a wonderful life for him. He was happier than he ever thought he could be, and his lust for the woman soon turned into true love. He loved her dearly. But the woman, well, she was lonely. He was gone all day fishing, and the people of the village, they didn't like her. They said her hair was too dark, her voice too harsh, her ways too odd. And so she spent most of her time in the cottage alone. And then, after about a year, a child was born, a boy, a bonny boy with the same dark hair and smooth tan skin of hers. And now she had something that she truly loved, something that she could spend her time with. And she liked to cuddle him. And even as he grew from an infant to a toddler to a small boy, he loved for his mother to hold him. And he liked to touch her soft skin and to smell it. For to him it smelled just like the ocean that they both loved. For every day when their chores were finished, they would race down that cliff to the sea where she taught him how to swim, and they picked up pretty stones and seashells, and she sang him songs and told him stories. And the years went by very happily for the boy. The woman was content, the Selkie woman, but the years were not kind to the Selkie woman. For as the years went by, her hair got brittle and gray and thin. Her skin was dry and cracked and wrinkled, and she just kept getting thinner and thinner. And she knew that if she did not soon get into her skin, that she would die. And so at the very hour of the day when the fisherman had taken her skin, she confronted him and said, "My skin, it is 7 years. You need to give me back my skin." "No, I don't know where I hid it." He loved her. He didn't want her to go. "Yes, you made a promise. You must give it back to me. I'm dying." He refused to see that. "No, I don't know where it is, woman. I can't give it to you if I don't know where it is." They argued, and their arguing woke the boy. He heard them. He listened to it all. And then finally, the fisherman stormed out of the house, whether it was from anger, frustration, or guilt. And the boy heard his mother go to her bed and cry herself to sleep. In the morning, when the boy woke up, the father was still gone, and his mother was asleep. He went outside like he did every morning, but instead of going to the outhouse, a wind came up, a strong wind, and it blew him into the barn, where something fell from the rafters. It was a skin. And when he picked it up and smelled it, It smelled of his mother, and he knew exactly what it was. And so he took it into the house and he laid it on the bed next to her, and she woke up. My skin, oh my Bonnie boy, thank you, I can go home now. And then she realized that now she could go home, she would live, but she would have to leave this child that she loved so dearly. And so she took his face in her hands, and she put her lips on his, and she blew 3 breaths into him. And then with the skin in her one arm, she grabbed his hand with the other, and they raced down that cliff path to the sea, where she put her skin back on. And they dove into the water, and she took him to a cave where the boy saw at least 12 Selkies all swimming and laughing and talking and playing games, telling stories. An old Selkie came up to them and said, "Daughter, I didn't think I'd ever see you again. And look, you brought a bonny boy to me, half seal and half human, my grandson. No, don't call him that. He cannot stay with us. He must go. He is just here to learn our ways." And so for 7 days, the boy stayed in that cave with the Selkies, and they played games with him. They taught him songs. They told him story after story. But then after 7 days, his mother took him back to that beach underneath his father's cottage. She once again put his face in her hands and her lips on his, and she breathed into his mouth one more time, and she said, "I'll always be with you." And then she was gone. The boy grew to be as kind a man as his father, but he was also a singer of songs and a teller of stories. People said that he had the breath of the Selkies in him, and he became a very popular Shawnee and was asked to tell stories everywhere. But no matter where he was, people would always see him walking along the beach, along the water, and it always seemed that there was a Selkie swimming alongside of him, and sometimes that Selkie would throw up pretty rocks and seashells to him, and they would laugh together. But his mother never came onto the shore ever again. And that's the end of the story. So this one, a little tiny risque. In Ireland, when tea came to Ireland, the Irish took to it, well, like they took to beer. They loved it. But the tea was not as easy to get as beer was. You couldn't just go to a pub and get it, and you couldn't buy it in a shop. It had to be delivered by peddlers. And they called these peddlers taymen. And everyone, especially the people that lived in the country, loved the taymen to come and visit, because sometimes it would be 3-4 weeks in between their visits. The women in the countryside around the village of Doolin in County Clare, they especially liked the Doolin taymen, for he had curly red hair and sparkling eyes and a little crooked smile that put their hearts to flutter. Well, one night there was a terrible, terrible storm. The wind was blowing, rain was pouring down, lightning and thunder, when O'Reilly heard a knock at his door. And when he opened it, it was the Doolin taymen. They hadn't seen him for 4 weeks. They were completely out of tea. They brought him in, and he and his wife Mary argued over how much tea they wanted and how much they could afford. And then when the deal was finally made, O'Reilly said to the taymen, "Oh, man, you can't be going out in the storm. You'll have to spend the night here." Well, the tayman was very pleased to hear that. And so the two men went out and unhitched his cart from the pony and put his pony in the caboose. Now, the caboose is, we'd call it a lean-to, and it was just attached to the house, this lean-to attached to the house where the animals were kept. So they were protected because of the sturdiness of the house, but that one wall of the house was extra warm because of the animals in there. So it was a nice, everybody benefited from it. So when they came back from the caboose, well, Mary was already making the tea. The two men sat down in front of the fire and got out their pipes and started telling stories. They were gossiping about the neighbors, when Mary went over to the fire and pulled out a covered pot. And she set it on the table, and then when she lifted that pot, the most delicious smell came out. And then she popped it over, and it was a loaf of brown bread, a perfect loaf of brown bread. She looked over at the Taman, and his teeth were practically swimming in his mouth for want of a piece of that bread. And Mary, well, she wanted to please him, so she picked up a knife to cut him a slice when her husband said, "Mary, you can't be cutting the brown bread when it's still warm. Why, it'll just turn to crumbs and only be good for feeding the chickens." Well, she kind of gave a little shrug to the Taman and then put the brown bread on the shelf to cool. By that time, the tea was ready, and so she poured each of them a cup, and they sat and talked and drank their tea, and then, oh, it was so good, they all had another cuppa when O'Reilly announced that it was time for bed. Now, this was a one-room cottage, and there was only one bed, but it was tradition in those days that whoever came to visit would share the bed with the family. Whether it was a friend, a neighbor, a stranger, a peddler, they would all stay in the same bed. But O'Reilly was a little jealous of this handsome Taman, so he thought for a minute, and he said, "Mary, now you go next to the wall, and I'll be in the middle, and the Taman can have the outside." Perfect. So they all got into bed as directed, and it was a tight fit. If one rolled over, they all rolled over. But they soon went to sleep. When, in the middle of the night, O'Reilly woke up with a pressure. You probably know what I mean, whether it was the time of his life or that second cup of tea. He needed to relieve this pressure, but he didn't want to leave those two in the bed. So he shook his wife and said, "Mary, come outside to the necessary with me." "No, I don't have to go." "Mary, come out with me." "No, I don't have to." "Mary, no." And she put the blankets over her head. Well, now the pressure was getting worse. He had to do something, and then he remembered their babe in the cradle. And so he got out of bed, and he picked up the cradle, and he set it between the two sleeping figures. Perfect. And he went outside, took care of business, came back in, put the cradle down on the floor, and got into bed and went to sleep. When just before dawn there was a huge gust of wind, and he woke up to a snap and a crack. The wind was blowing the roof off of the caboose. Thinking only of his animals, he ran out the door. Oh, Mary lifted herself up on one elbow and looked at the Taman and said, "Well, now you can have what you've been wanting." And his eye twinkled, and he gave her that little grin, and he jumped out of bed. He grabbed that brown bread, cut a slice, and it was just as delicious as he had hoped. I like that one. I heard it from a real Irishman one time, a long time ago, so I think it's a good one. So Riley went to trial for armed robbery. The different Riley, that was O'Reilly. The jury foreman came back and announced not guilty. O'Reilly was thrilled. He shouted, "That's grand! Does that mean I get to keep the money?" So my final story, I think, right? Or do we have time for two more? Two more? Okay. So in Ireland, they tell many stories about fairies. Now, the fairies come in all different sizes, none of which look like Tinkerbell. But they also come in all different dispositions. All of them, however, love everything that's beautiful. And for the most part, all of them hate humans. But they love human babies, and they covet them greatly. Now, some people think that this is because fairies have a hard time giving birth, and when they do, their children are usually ugly and misshapen. And so if they hear about a beautiful human child, and if they can, they will switch, and they will take the human child and give them their ugly child. And we call those children changelings. And this is the story of one such changeling. Elin was a happy young woman. She had a good husband, Morven. He was kind, hardworking, and quite handsome. They had a little cottage. It was only one room, but it was theirs. And now they had Lorik, their 3-month-old babe, and Elin thought he was the most beautiful child that had ever been born. And she would tell him this all the time. "Oh, Lorik, there's no child in the world that is more beautiful than you." Morven and everyone else would say, "Elin, you can't be saying that to the boy. The fairies will hear you." "Oh, I can't help it. He's just so perfect. He's the most perfect child that ever was." And so she continued telling the boy how beautiful he was. Well, one morning she was feeding Lorik, and she was talking to him as she always did, and she said, "Now, Lorik, today is laundry day, and so we'll be playing in the water in the suds today. Your father, he's off plowing with the neighbors. I think we'll make him a pork stew when he comes home. Your father does love his park." She was so intent on her child that she didn't see the shadow in the window. When she finished feeding Lorik, he fell asleep, as he always did, and she put him in the cradle that his father had made for him and kissed him on the forehead and said, "Now, Lorik, you stay asleep. I've just got to go to the community fountain and get the water. I'll be back in just a bit." And so she grabbed the 2 buckets and went out the door, not seeing the figure standing, hiding behind the tree. When Elin filled the buckets, she headed back home, and a bird flew right past her and landed in a tree and then started to twitter, "Elin, Elin, hurry, hurry, trouble, trouble, worry, worry." Oh, what an imagination I've got. I thought that bird was saying my name. But the bird flew past again and landed in a bush and twittered again, "Elin, Elin, hurry, hurry, trouble, trouble, worry, worry." Why, that bird did say my name. And so she began to walk faster. She was just within view of the cottage when she heard the scream for the first time. "Lorik!" she yelled, and she dropped the buckets and she ran to the cottage, thinking, did a bee sting him? Did an animal get into the house and into his cradle? She burst through the door and ran to the cradle, ready to snatch her child up to comfort him. And she got there and, oh, Lorik, Lorik, what happened to you? Gone was his beautiful, smooth, soft skin. Now it was gray and lumpy and blotchy with molds all over it. His soft, downy hair was now long and greasy, and it stuck out every which way. His tiny hands were claws that tore at the blanket that she'd so lovingly made while she was in her waiting time. His eyes were black holes, and his mouth was wide, wide open, and from it came the most horrible screams. She knew she needed to pick him up, but she just couldn't bring herself to. But she knew Morven would know what to do. She was afraid to leave the boy, so she grabbed the hunting horn off the wall and went to the door, and she blew. And the plowmen heard the sound. One of them said, "Why, that's a hunting horn, and it isn't even hunting season." "No," said Morven, "that's me father's horn. I'd recognize that noise anywhere. There must be something wrong at the cottage." So he sat down, laid down his plow, and he ran to the cottage. He too was just within sight of it when he heard the screams. He ran to the cradle standing next to Elin, and he looked down and he yelled, "Stop your screaming, or we'll not give you anything to eat." "Morven, how can you yell at Lorik like that? He's just a babe." "Elin, this isn't Lorik. It's a changeling. The fairies have taken our boy and left this creature here." "Oh, Morven, what are we going to do?" "Well, Elin, I know what it is, but I don't know what to do about it. But I've got to stop that screaming." So he grabbed a loaf of brown bread off the shelf and he threw it into the cradle. The changeling grabbed it with those claws and started gnawing at it. And while it ate, the screaming stopped, and the two talked, trying to figure out what they could do. And when it started screaming again, they threw more food into the cradle. And then they heard a knock at the door. And when they opened it, it was Friedrich, the oldest of the plowmen. "When you didn't come back to the plow, and I thought maybe something was wrong and I could help." They pointed to the cradle, and he went over and looked down in it and said, "Ha, you got yourself a changeling, and a right nasty one at that." "Well, you know what we can do?" "I've got an idea, but you'll have to come outside. I don't want the changeling hearing what I have to say." Excuse me. They went outside and shut the door, and Friedrich said, "Does your boy talk yet?" "No, he's only 3 months old." "Good. Then you've got to trick the changeling into saying something that no child would ever know." "Well, how can I do that?" And he told her exactly what to do. And when he finished, she said, "Oh, I don't know if I can." "You can, lass, and you will. Now I'm going to take the neighbors, the plowmen, and bring them closer. So when you're finished and you need Mervyn, then you can call for him. But now you need to go in and do exactly what I said." Her husband grabbed her and kissed her on the cheek and said, "You can do it, lass. I know you can." And they left, and Elin took a deep breath, and she went into the cottage, and in as chipper voice as she could muster, she said, "Well, and don't we have a busy day today?" And she spent the rest of the day doing the chores that she wouldn't normally do, dusting, cleaning, polishing the linen chest, and throwing food into the cradle. And that changeling watched her every move. In the late afternoon, she propped the changeling up in the cradle so he could see exactly what she was doing. And then she went over to the fire and built it up to make a good cooking fire. She cracked an egg, and then she began filling pork into the empty eggshell. "What are you doing, Mother?" The sound from that cradle made chills go down her back, but she said as lightly as she could, "Why, I'm making supper for the 12 plowmen. When I get this eggshell filled, well, I'll pop it into the fire, and we'll have a feast when they get here." "Har, har, har! I've seen an acorn turn into an oak tree, but I've never seen an eggshell feed 12 plowmen." "I've got you, you nasty thing. No babe could see an acorn grow into an oak tree. You must be at least 100 years old." And she went to the door and she yelled, "Mervyn, come and get him. I've got him and you can take him out of here." He ran down to the cottage and grabbed that cradle, and they took it up to the crossroads where the fairy tree grew, and they set it in the crossroads, and Mervyn yelled, "Come and get your changeling and bring us back our boy." The thing was screaming and screaming and screaming the whole time. When they got back to the house, they could still hear those screams. They couldn't even eat because of the noise. They decided to go to bed early. They thought maybe by shutting the doors of the bed box that it would muffle the sound, but it only did a little. And so it was very late in the night when they finally fell into a difficult sleep. But when they awoke in the morning, they heard nothing. And when they opened the bed box doors, it was just birds that they heard. And so they ran out of the cottage and up to the crossroads and looked into the cradle, and smiling up at them was their boy, Lorik. Elin snatched him up in her arms and carried him home, and from that day on she never left Lorik or his 2 younger brothers alone again. And they all grew to be good, hard-working, and handsome men, just like their father. And that's the end. So this is the one that kind of has a story at the end just for you, and just as Jim had said to you in the beginning, he kind of set me up with this one. So long ago in Ireland, there lived a poor farmer. Now, didn't he have enough land for 8 or 10 cattle? But if the truth be known, he had nary a one. And what with the money-grubbing landlords and the blight on the potatoes, well, he was near to starving. When one day he heard about a farm workers' fair over in County Cork. The landowners there, 'twas said, would pay a good price for a hard day's work. 'Twas said that the land there was rich and fertile. Why, if you put your side down to go and get yourself a bite to eat, you'd have to be looking for it in the grass that grew up while he was gone. And so the poor farmer decided to become what was known then as a wandering farm worker. And he set off for County Cork with only the sky as his blanket and the earth as his pillow. Well, he hadn't gone far when one night didn't it begin to rain, and he knew he had to be finding a shelter, when he looked up and he saw a little white cottage with a thatched roof and a light in the window. And he went up to the cottage and he knocked on the door, and it was opened by a wee little man and a wee little woman. And they invited him in and set him at the table, and they gave him a fine spread. And when he was done eating, the 3 of them sat in front of the fire smoking their pipes, when the wee little woman says, "And so, you'll be telling us the news of the world then?" For in those days, the Wanderers were the newspaper and radio for the country folk. But the wandering farm worker was a shy man, and he just hung his head and said, nary a bit. But the wee little man puffed on his pipe a bit more, and then he looks at him and says, well, you'll be telling us a story then, to bide away the evening. Well, the wandering farm worker's face turned as red as his hair. And he said, I've no song to sing, no tune to play, no story to tell. And the wee little man puffed on his pipe a bit more and looked at him and said, well, then you'll be getting the water that we'll be needing in the morning. Well, the wandering farm worker was glad to have something to do, and so he picked up the white enamel bucket and he went out to the back of the house, and he hung it over the well, and he started lowering that bucket down into the well when it gave a bit of a jerk. Well, thinking it was caught on the side of the well, he leaned over to loosen it a bit when all of a sudden the mother and father of all jerks pulled him arse over elbow down into that well, where he fell for what seemed to be 3 eternities, when he finally landed with a plop. But it wasn't at the bottom of a well. 'Twas in a bog. Well, he was picking himself up and checking himself over to see that he had all of his parts and all of his parts were whole, when he heard voices coming out of the fog. And he looked up, and here came 3 burly men, and wasn't they carrying a coffin? Well, as they got up to him, he heard the first one, says he, and who'll be shouldering the 4th corner of this coffin? The wandering farm worker, was the reply. Well, the farm worker's heart went right into his stomach when he heard that they was talking about him. But they snatched him up and they put him under the 4th corner of that coffin, and they took off running like that farm worker had never run before. Through the bog, over a bridge, into a glen. If he tried to even stop for a minute, didn't they give him a look that would peel paint or curdle milk? And finally, when he didn't think that he could run another bit, they stopped in front of a high wall. And the wandering farm worker's heart went right into his feet when he read the words on that wall, cemetery for young men. When he was backing up to see if he could make his escape, when the first one says, and who'll be getting the coffin over the wall? The wandering farm worker. So they snatched him up and they gave him the coffin, and he pushed and he shoved, and he finally got that coffin over that wall, and it being 8 feet if it was an inch. And then he was backing up again to make his escape when the first one says, and who'll be digging the grave? They grabbed him, the wandering farm worker. And they threw him over that wall like he was nothing but a rag doll, and they gave him a shovel, and he began to dig, and it was hard work. And if he stopped just to catch a breath, didn't the 3 push the dirt back in to make the work even harder? And finally, when he was finished and he was crawling out of that grave, and a fine grave it was, he hears the first one say, and who'll we be putting into that coffin? Well, this time he didn't wait for the reply. He took off running like he'd never run before, the 3 of them behind him, swearing up a blue streak. He jumped over that wall like it was nothing but a wee garden fence, the 3 of them behind him, swearing like sailors. He ran a hill at a leap, a glen at a step, 32 feet at a running jump, until finally, in the middle of the night, when he couldn't hear the 3 of them behind him anymore, he saw a house up ahead. And he ran up to that house, and he pounded on the door, and it was opened by the wee little man. Says he, well, now you've got a story for us, I trust. Well, the wandering farm worker fainted dead away. When he woke up, the sun was high in the sky, and he saw that he was lying next to the well. And next to him was the white enamel bucket, all filled with water. Well, he got up and he picked up the bucket and turned to go to the house. But where the night before had been a little white cottage with a thatched roof, now was just a ruin. Well, I can tell you that man wasted no shoe leather getting to the next village, and it was right to the public house he went, and it was 2 porters and a whiskey before that man could talk. But from that day on, he always had a story. Now, I tell you what I heard, and I heard what was said, but I can tell you this. If you're ever going on a wandering journey of your own, you best be taking along a story or 2, for you never know when you might be needing one. And that's the end.